Hey there. So I was watching a video posted a couple weeks ago by Pagyptsian called Naming Our Gods, and I thought it was a really thoughtful look at why she chooses to ascribe her own names to particular kinds of deities, why she envisions particular deities according to her own unique blend of characteristics that can be quite encompassing, but then names them a particular way, and essentially shared her reasons for why she does this. I'll link the video in the description so you'll be able to pop over and see it yourself. But it sort of got me thinking about the ascription of names and what that really means when we use general names, general terms like the crone, or more specific names like Hecate, or Hecate, or Hecate, or, if you're all into Shakespeare, Hecate, specific names for deity that are popularly known and that refer to a particular goddess with a particular subset of myths associated with her. How these sorts of names, whether they're specific, general, public, private, relate to characteristics of the deity themselves. And I was sitting here and I just started jotting out my ideas, and I thought I'd share some of them with you, just for fun, so that anybody interested can take a look and maybe join me in conversation about it. So this will be a little bit of a visual video because I'm going to be essentially graphing what I'm talking about for you as I go. Now, I'll have set this up beforehand so that you don't spend much of the video watching me write. But I thought this idea of graphically representing the sorts of names that we use for various goddesses, for instance, and how they fall according to the two axes that I've drawn out, well, I thought that that would really help clarify how, to my mind, their names really influence how we relate to them and what these sorts of conceptualizations of deity are particularly useful for or facilitate. So for those of you who haven't taken math class for a while and can't quite remember, the x-axis is the horizontal line here, and the y-axis is the vertical line here. And you can see that I've named these two axes trait specificity and common conceptualization. And both of them go from more to less, or less to more. And what I'm arguing here is basically that you can take any goddess name, any goddess, and drop her somewhere on this grid and get a sense of some of the characteristics that are associated with where she falls based on what kinds of names we're using. So the x-axis, the one labeled trait specificity, really denotes the extent to which a goddess has unique aspects, good identifiers that are non-generic. So if we take the example of physical appearance, a goddess that is old, perhaps cloaked, and that's about as much detail as you really get, well, that would be pretty low trait specificity. There isn't a great deal of picture showing up there for you. It leaves a lot to the imagination, and it is widely applicable across a large number of deities. Whereas high trait specificity would be something along the lines of carries an apple around with her, wears Manolo Blancos, flips her hair when she laughs, and what have you. The more of that kind of detail you get, the higher the trait specificity, the more of a personality, a flavor that deity has. And the extent to which traits about a particular goddess are specific can be used as a measure of essentially how abstract she is. So with low trait specificity, you'd have a more abstract conceptualization. And then with increasing trait specificity, you end up with a more and more relatable goddess, as it were. Somebody who has more and more of a personality that you can get to know, that you can narrow down. Now the y-axis, common conceptualization, really refers to the extent to which we as a community, a large number of people, share a common concept of this deity. So how many of us know her? How many of us have a particular sort of image come to mind when you say her name? To what extent is she familiar to a large number of people? And based on these two axes, I think you can take any goddess you can think of and drop her somewhere on this grid. For example, when I say the crone, well, the crone is a figure that a lot of us have worked with, a lot of us are familiar with. So that is a goddess with very high common conceptualization. We are familiar with the concept of the crone. Many of us have strong associations with what that means. Having said that, her trait specificity is very low because when you use the simple generic the crone, there is very little specific myth or lore that you can sort of drape on that name. There are many crone goddesses who have names of their own and who are associated with detailed and rich lore, but the crone is sort of this overarching concept that embraces them all. And so her trait specificity is incredibly low because she encapsulates all of these other ideas. Now, if you take one of these goddesses often perceived as falling under the realm of the crone, let's say Hecate, well, Hecate still has high common conceptualization. She as a figure is well known to many people, but she also has much more trait specificity. Her specific associations with hounds, crossroads, carrying a torch, carrying a key, carrying a dagger, her role in the tutelage of Medea, her garden. All of these specific traits make her more personable, give her a stronger identity that is unique to her. And so she falls in the top right corner of this grid. Now, our decision of whether to use the crone, a general archetype that encapsulates so many other goddesses, versus a specific named goddess with a particular personality, like Hecate, assuming you work with both, well, that decision of whom to work with at any given time may, for instance, depend on how relatable an identity you want to be working with for a particular spell, ritual, what have you. If there is a named goddess who is well known from a pantheon that you're familiar with, who has all of the characteristics that you're looking for in a deity for a particular sort of ritual or spell, well, then you may choose to work with that particular goddess. If she fits the bill of what you're looking for and you want somebody with that strong identity, well, then you might pick her. But what if none of those goddesses quite fit the bill? Well, a lot of us will slide back down to the more abstract side of this chart and end up working instead with a super archetype like the crone, or the mother, or the maiden, or the warrior, or what have you. Stripping away specific details so that we are not sacrificing aspects of the personality that we want to work with. In essence, removing detail to ensure that we're not losing components that are important to us. Now, what of the lower end of the common conceptualization part of this chart? Well, again, you can have greater or less trait specificity on this end of the chart. But this end of the chart is really the personal goddesses, the ones we name ourselves, and that Pagyptsian was, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name, Pagyptsian? Don't you hate it when you read a word many, many times and then the first time you go to say it out loud, it occurs to you that you have no frickin' idea how to pronounce it? Anyways, Pagyptsian? This is the sort of naming of one's own goddess that Pagyptsian was talking about. Which is not to say that she thinks about it in the way that I'm describing it here at all. Merely that the lowest point on this axis of common conceptualization is a goddess that embodies characteristics that deviate from established norms, those of established goddesses, whether in tone or in particulars, and who has a unique name that we have given her, and that nobody else shares or uses. Now, of course, this is a continuous scale, so you can also keep in mind that there will be very, very well-known goddesses who would be at the very high end of this axis, like Athena. And then there will be less well-known goddesses further down on this axis. But right at the bottom of this axis are the names we invent ourselves for deity. But even when we invent these names ourselves, when we give these names to deities that we're working with, well, those deities can still fall anywhere on the x-axis. They can have less or more trait specificity. And as Pagyptsian, mentioned, you might want to do this if you have a particular angle from which you want to approach, a particular flavor you seek to ascribe to the more common conceptualizations that we use. So for instance, I may choose to work with a goddess whom I name the sleeping womb, and she may be quite abstract. There may be very few specific identifiers that I hang on that name that encompasses this idea of returning to the earth with death waiting to be reborn, which is a particular subtype or slant perception of the crone archetype. Conversely, I may name a goddess Cytheria, a chthonic goddess who is fearless and certain, whose role is to guide me through the subterranean caverns of my psyche. And she would have both low common conceptualization and high trait specificity. And she also represents another alternative to what I was discussing before. If you don't have a named familiar goddess from a pantheon who meets all of the characteristics that you're looking for, well, rather than sliding left along the x-axis until you get to a more abstract end that encompasses these concepts, you can actually stay super far to the right and slide down the y into more personal territory, conceiving of a goddess, a set of archetypal features that remain detailed enough that she maintains some personability, that you feel like she is a person that you can work with, less distant and unknowable than the crone. Now, depending on your personal conceptualization of the divine, the divide between the top half of this graph and the bottom half may have other significance as well. For instance, if you see deity as the emergent consciousness of our collective beliefs, then it follows that because we all have a hand in shaping those divinities, then those identities will be more stable, for instance, across time, although perhaps still mutable. And it may also mean that you might not get along with any individual deity, not merely because there are features of their mythology or associations that don't really jive with you, but because there may be aspects of your personality that deviate from the vast majority of the people whose consciousness is combining to form this deity. And perhaps in that case, sliding down to the bottom of this graph, although it removes, perhaps, if you think of it this way, some of the power gained by having so much input into a particular archetype or identity or goddess. It's a trade-off you're making for closeness, similarity, a feel or flavor that is ideally suited to you or your needs. Then again, I'm not really all that convinced that you can't trace the outline around the constellation of consciousnesses that are contributing to the emergence of particular characteristics in different deities and create an equivalently powerful one that isn't necessarily a being before you get to it, that doesn't necessarily emerge naturally from the whole, but is still lying in wait sort of beneath the surface. Which is to say that the concept of power doesn't necessarily apply. And again, this is all a function of your particular perception of deity, archetype, where it comes from and what it means. I guess you could think of it the same way as you think of a new tarot deck with new art that casts a brand new light on cards you thought you knew well. The card meanings may stay the same, more or less. They're still identifiable and familiar, but that new art, that new packaging, subtly shifts a whole constellation of meanings and associations for you. introducing brand new identities to that card. And so although I haven't actually spent much time thinking about specifically naming my own deity, tweaking the packaging, as it were, providing a name that captures those aspects of archetype that I want specifically to highlight and work with, I do think this sort of grid is something I will be keeping in mind in the future, and that will be able to inform me with regards to what approach I want to take to divinity in any particular scenario, with any particular working. So there we go. That was my little riff on naming our gods. I hope you enjoyed it. There is a good chance that I will be doing more of these little riff videos, because a great deal of what I like about the pagan YouTube community are the ideas you guys give me and playing around with them and tweaking them for myself. So if this tickled you, check back for others. I'm sure they will be posted at some point. Until then, have a fantastic night.